Welcome to Xi Jinping Briefing. The content of the briefing includes: woke ideology must not take over defense. Your weekend reading: U.S. courts and Congress turn to November. The West's crisis of confidence is feeding Putin's tyrannical delusions. It's time to stand up to China over the Red Sea. Woke ideology must not take over defense. Telegraph. The UK's armed forces have been neglected by both Labour and Tory governments over the past 20 years, resulting in a hollowed-out and underfunded military. There is evidence that some defense officials prioritize diversity and inclusion over national security, with the army reportedly wanting to relax security checks for overseas recruits to boost diversity. This prioritization of identity politics and woke ideology over national security is dangerous and must be stopped. Britain is facing numerous threats from rearming enemies, and it is crucial to have a well-funded and lethal fighting force. Denying the armed forces the investment they need and embracing divisive ideologies undermines their capabilities. Your weekend reading: U.S. courts and Congress turn to November. Bloomberg. The U.S. Supreme Court has indicated it is likely to reject efforts to bar Donald Trump from the ballot over his role in the January 6 attack on the U.S. Capitol. The court may also be asked to rule on whether Trump can be prosecuted for attempting to subvert the 2020 election. Meanwhile, congressional Republicans have abandoned a bipartisan deal on border security and Ukraine funding after Trump told them to do so. President Joe Biden has pledged to use the failed legislation as a political tool. In other news, inflation revision data has shown no significant changes to the consumer price index, and Chinese stocks have dropped by almost $5 trillion since their 2021 peak. The West's crisis of confidence is feeding Putin's tyrannical delusions. Telegraph. In an op-ed for The Guardian, Simon Jenkins argues that Vladimir Putin's recent interview with the Financial Times was a bizarre attempt to rewrite history and justify Russia's actions in Ukraine. Jenkins argues that Putin's narrative of Russia as a peace-loving country that has been betrayed by the West has become the official stance since the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Jenkins questions why the Russian population appears to be buying into Putin's rhetoric, arguing that the blend of mystic religious destiny and rapacious capitalism should be questionable to most educated Russians. However, Jenkins notes that the educated professional classes in Moscow and St. Petersburg are largely sheltered from the economic problems facing the rest of the country. Jenkins concludes that the West's self-loathing and apocalyptic rhetoric is not only demoralizing its own people but is also playing into Putin's hands. It's time to stand up to China over the Red Sea. Telegraph. The People's Republic of China, PRC, is unwilling to offer financial, diplomatic, or military support in defending the Red Sea's vital trade route with Europe, despite being the route for $120 billion of Chinese imports and $160 billion of Chinese exports each year. Chinese cargo ships have not been immune from the disruption in the Red Sea, with trade data in December recording a 10 to 15% drop in Chinese exports overseas, resulting in increased costs of $3 million per ship. The PRC abstained on the UN Security Council resolution sanctioning action in the Bab al-Mandab Strait. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Dr. Six, your resident observer from the 6 Degrees world, here to give you a rundown of some interesting news stories from around the globe. Strap in and get ready for some witty analysis and thought-provoking discussions. First up, we have a concerning situation in the UK. The armed forces have been neglected and underfunded for the past 2 decades, and now there are reports that diversity and inclusivity are being prioritized over national security. Now, don't get me wrong, diversity is important, but we can't let woke ideology take over our defense. We need a strong and well-funded military to deal with the threats we are facing. Let's hope the powers that be realize this before it's too late. Moving across the pond to the US, it seems like the drama surrounding Donald Trump just won't go away. The Supreme Court is likely to reject efforts to bar him from the ballot, and there may be a ruling on whether he can be prosecuted for attempting to subvert the 2020 election. Meanwhile, congressional Republicans have abandoned a bipartisan deal after Trump's influence. It's like a never-ending reality TV show, isn't it? Let's hope the politicians can focus on the real issues and not get caught up in the Trump circus. Now, let's talk about Vladimir Putin and his delusions of grandeur. In a recent interview, he tried to rewrite history and justify Russia's actions in Ukraine. It's a bizarre attempt that seems to be working on some Russians, despite the questionable narrative. Jenkins, in his op-ed, highlights how the West's self-loathing and apocalyptic rhetoric is playing right into Putin's hands. It's time for the West to regain its confidence and stand up to such tyrannical delusions. Lastly, we turn our attention to China and the Red Sea. Despite relying heavily on the trade route through the Red Sea, China is unwilling to offer support in defending it. This is puzzling, considering the billions of dollars of imports and exports that pass through each year. It seems like China is content to let others shoulder the burden. Perhaps it's time for the international community to hold China accountable and ensure the safety and security of this vital trade route. Well, folks, that's all for today's news roundup. I hope you found it informative and entertaining. Now it's your turn. What are your thoughts on these stories? Do you agree with my analysis, or do you have a different perspective? Let's get the discussion going. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.